going back to the music, you go back to the 50s of our parents or our older generation. In the 60s, it was all about love and romance. But then around somewhere, probably just before the Beatles, it started changing. And I think that in our time, there was far more music that had a social or a political commentary. You start with Buffalo Springfield and you go through. And I think even the Beatles got caught up into that, and then they changed it. And I used to go to Greenwich Village, but I used to go to Cambridge, and I didn't go inside.
Friday night, Harvard Square.
Yeah, I didn't go inside, but I went to it here past. Everybody can take up just one page, but just, you know, and I'm a big folkie, and you talk about music stations. There were no music stations per se to listen to folk music, but transistor radios. Anybody have a transistor radio? Yeah. And that's to me, and I'd never had a car. We'd get a transistor radio, and we'd listen to Everly Brothers and stuff like that. And then, again, technology drove a lot of what we're talking about. If you didn't have a radio, you're not going to get much of the music. Well, and then turntables. I didn't have a turntable, I think, till I was in college. And then you get tape decks, eight track, right? Yeah. And so as the technology changes, the music, the availability to us changes. And again, it was probably around 67 or so that the music really took off. And then you throw in drugs. Drugs certainly slanted the music that we listened to.
It was a piece of my heart.
Number 96 for the year.
Yeah, she was real. It was someone who I'd never really listened to until I got, into college, and the music majors were saying, "Oh, listen to this chick here. And she's got something." And one of my great regrets is that she was at a concert over at Harvard Stadium in '68.
But then you had the Bee Gees, and you had the Beach Boys, and the Beatles, of course, and the Stones, Aretha Franklin, Motown, as I recall. I don't exactly have particular memories, but I do remember there was this huge mix of sort of like the old classic smoothies and good music, mixed in with that horrible Jimi Hendrix and drugs and the Doors.
You didn't like it?
No, I'm just saying from the traditional point of view.
Oh, right, yeah.
Jimi Hendrix and the Doors, Jim Morrison, and all of those.
Especially if you were a young, impressionable teenage girl. I mean, that was it. You were just, had all these fantasies about, oh my gosh, which Beatle,
But I do remember a lot of Aretha Franklin.
Labor songs of the Wobblies back at the beginning of the last century, the prior century, which had a resurgence in the fight against fascism and during the Depression. I'm thinking of all the Okie singers and so forth, and came back again in the turbulence of the 60s. Or the fact that the Beatles, Elvis Presley, probably owe their rhythms and so forth to African American music, not only blues and gospel, which had a tremendous influence on the movements of the 60s. When I was sitting in at the Pentagon, the old Negro spiritual, "I'm going to lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside," that was the anthem of the thousands that were gathered there. Like a tree that's planted by the water, we shall not be moved. Remember 1990 or 91 when we were trying to stop Clean Harbors from putting the sludge plant in the old Fort River shipyard. I participated in all of the marches and everything and the picketing. And things were pretty dull, and folks were pretty bored, so I tried to get folks singing. I tried to intone some of the songs of struggle, like "We Shall Not Be Moved" or "Down by the Riverside," and nobody there, a cultural vacuum, nobody there knew enough to even recognize what I was trying to do. So it was, but on the other hand, in the labor movement and in the ongoing fights around liberties and so forth, there was that collective memory. 1968, my future wife and I went to Fenway Park for a Gene McCarthy for President rally, and Seeger was there. He had emerged from the blacklist, and it was electrifying. It was the first time I had heard such progressive music, so I wasn't getting it from the commercial stations. And he sang "Pequot Soldiers," brought us back to the anthem of the victims of the Nazis that escaped from Dachau and took to Spain to fight against fascism there, and so much else. So that was a tremendous growth for me personally. Joan Baez went from the coffee shops of Cambridge or whatever to the fields of California, became a main vehicle for getting the message of the Filipino and Chicano agricultural workers out into the mainstream. Even Joni Mitchell, whom I think came a few years later, both sides now, and many others interjected that. But again, I think the Beatles did recognize the African American roots of the themes and so forth, but that wasn't generally acknowledged. The rich and diverse and conflicted history of this country that came to the surface. War versus peace, freedom versus repression. For the, again, a resurgence of maybe the upsurge in the women's movement that we saw with the suffragettes.